Hello.
Hello, Kofi. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Are you talking to me?
No, I was talking to Bob, but he's on mute.
Okay. All right.
No, I'm good. I'm good. I'm great. We are all here now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I shared the link with some colleagues from Uganda and Kenya. So they might be popping up in the participants.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So Kabaso, what is the protocol like? In the next 2 minutes, some guidance of some kind?
Yes, initially I was going to start with Prof. Munyai. I was going to introduce him first, but I don't know, Kofi, do you mind going first? Or it's short notice?
That's okay, but you can start with somebody else.
For sure. Then I'm going to start with Paul.
Yes.
You will
Please.
speak first.
Have you received
You're
my
putting me on
short?
the spot.
Have you received my short CV?
A brief one. I did get something.
Okay, no, that's fine. You don't have to read the whole thing. Just the beginning is enough. Okay. Remember, I'm filling in for Prof. Munyai, so I don't want to take away his lackluster.
Sure.
Mm.
Bob, it looks like you and I will be on the circuit a little bit next week or the week after, and even the week after that.
Yeah, no, it looks like it's that season once more, as well as going into the rest of the year. There's these activities.
Oh,
yes. Yeah.
The Strathmore initiative as well as USIU process.
Yeah, no, certainly. Yeah. There's quite a few things coming up. And
yes.
Good to reconnect for certain.
Yeah, it will be good to reconnect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just give it one more minute. I see people are still joining, and then we can start.
All right.
Right. So I suppose we are all set.
Yeah, I think we can start, and the others can join us in the middle as we would have already started. Thank you very much, colleagues, and everyone who's joining us today for this very interesting webinar. And good afternoon. Good morning for those joining from the US, like Paul. My name is Kabaso Kawe. I'm from the Center for the African Center for the Study of the US here at this university. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today for this very interesting webinar to discuss the implications of the recent South African election and its unprecedented outcome, what has been termed as the most heavily contested election in the history of the country, and one in which we have seen that for the first time in 30 years, the ANC has lost its majority, garnering just over 40% of the vote, and will now be looking at forming either coalitions or a government of national unity, and therefore putting the country on a new political path for the first time since the end of apartheid. While we wait for this to be announced, we thought it was important to convene this webinar nonetheless to just discuss what this entails for the future of South Africa, the future of youth in the country, and South Africa on the global stage. So our main questions for this discussion, therefore, I think we saw on the poster, what do the elections portend for South Africans' relations with the BRICS and the Global South? How this election outcome impacts South Africa's relations with the Global North broadly, and South Africa-US relations in particular. We're also going to be touching on what the elections mean for South Africa's role in Israeli war, in the Israeli war in Gaza, including the case at the ICC, and how the markets will respond to whichever new leadership will emerge as the talks are going on. So on this webinar, we're privileged to have a panel of speakers who have enormous experience and passion for these issues that we'll be discussing. Allow me to introduce the speakers this afternoon. We have Kofi Kwaku, who is a senior research fellow at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg and managing director of Stratum Futures. Kofi is standing in for Professor David Monyai, who couldn't join us today. Other speakers are Paul Nantulia, who's a research associate for the Defense Security Cooperation Agency at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies in Washington, DC. We have Bob Wekesa, who's the director of the African Center for the Study of the US here at WITS, and he's also a visiting professor at Howard University. And we have Valerie Buthelezi, who's a research fellow at the center here at WITS. And also she is a physical and human geographer who specializes in climatology and sustainability science. Valerie will be speaking to us on the youth vote and what the South African election implies for the youth vote and its implications for the future. So this webinar is going to last for about an hour, 30 minutes. We'll be able to take questions at the end after all the speakers have spoken. However, during the presentations, feel free, please, to type any questions that you may have in the chat, and we may take them as and when, but generally we'll try and take questions at the end. Yeah, thank you very much to our speakers, and to kick us off, I'll hand over to Paul to begin the discussion. Thank you very much. Paul, please, you can take over.
Thank you very much. Is my sound coming through?
Yes, please, we can hear you.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a homecoming because I lived in South Africa for many years in my younger days. Studied there, worked there, got my first employment there. So I've experienced South Africa, and a part of me is certainly South African. My daughter was born there. It's really a pleasure, and I've worked with the panelists. I've worked with Bob for a long time, so I'm very, very honored to join him on this panel. And very many moons ago, I was with Kofi. We were sitting out in Pretoria during the early days of the Mbeki administration, which was developing the NEPAD process. And so we were working on that. So I'm very, very happy. This is really like a homecoming. Look, I think, let me say 3 opening things about this election and the impact in Africa and also on South Africa's foreign policy. There's a lot of uncertainty for sure, because any political transition and negotiation of this nature brings with it opportunities and but risks as well. The stakes are very, very high. Couldn't be higher. A lot of South African colleagues that I've spoken with, and I agree with them, believe that South Africa may very well be facing another CODESA moment, the Convention for Democratic South Africa, which midwifed the transition from apartheid to democracy. It may very well be. But one of the things that that process bequeathed to South Africa, and which is my first point, is dexterity in negotiations. South Africans understand the art of political negotiation. South Africa and South Africans negotiated their very, very complicated and complex transition to democracy without external assistance or interference, without external facilitation. I think this is one of the first case studies in conflict resolution where protagonists that were deeply divided and had fought each other for over half a century were able to get a democratic breakthrough without external facilitation. And very many of the people that were involved in this process are still around. And South Africa has that institutional memory to draw on. And in fact, it's been very encouraging to see in the press and in the voluminous debates on the South African media that South Africans are recalling CODESA and are offering proposals that might be able to move the country beyond this particular process. This is critically important, not just for South Africa, but also for the African continent and the rest of the world, because the rest of the world still has a lot to learn from South Africa about how to negotiate protracted conflict and about how to negotiate and navigate a political transition. And I think that the successful stewardship of this particular process is actually going to strengthen South Africa's foreign policy fundamentals significantly. So I think that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing that I would say is that, and here I'm now focusing on the foreign aspect of it, the foreign relations aspect of it. South African foreign policy fundamentals are very strong. I do not see a significant shift in the basic pillars of South Africa's foreign policy towards the developing world, towards the rest of Africa, and internationally. I think over the past years, South Africa has really punched way above its weight in terms of its participation in various strategic centers of gravity of the world, such as the BRICS, such as currently right now the non-aligned movement, the G20, the G7, and the G77. I don't think there'll be significant changes because I think the fundamentals are strong. And I think it would be erroneous to refer to South Africa's foreign policy as ANC foreign policy. It is true that the ANC historically has taken strong positions, for instance, on the situations in Palestine, in situations in other parts of the world, such as Western Sahara, Morocco, and so on. South Africa has taken very, very strong positions on these. And these issues South Africa takes positions on are deeply connected to South Africa's own experience. South Africa has a way of drawing affinities with others that it believes face the same conditions that it faced during apartheid. So I don't think that is going to change. And I think it would be fair to say that these elements and strands of South Africa's foreign policy are not just a product of the ANC, but they're also a product of South African society at large. I mean, I recall in my days in Durban, there were always discussions and manifestations in support of Palestine. In fact, that's this is I first met Palestinians when I was in Durban, right? These were not ANC engagements; these were basically South African civic engagements, right? And we can look at a whole range of other foreign policy issues within the South African realm. So those positions that South Africa takes internationally are broadly shared beyond the ANC and beyond the ANC's Congress alliance. So I do not think that they will change significantly. My third point is in terms of the African continent, in terms of lessons that African countries can learn from the South African experience. Right now, certainly, as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be a lot of back and forth. The parties have got to go back to their structures to get matching orders. Right now, a lot of the parties are basically putting their red lines on the table and so on. But we all know that in negotiations, eventually, these negotiations are going to transform into interest-based negotiations that will then be able to get us to an outcome. This is important for the rest of Africa because, I mean, if you look at how these elections were conducted, now, problems notwithstanding, I personally, I am yet to see an election on the continent where everybody has access to the IEC web platform. Everybody who had an internet connection had access to the tallies from each of the voting districts. There were live feeds that were showing what was going on in the Results Operation Center. Media, party agents, IEC officials interacting freely in the ROC. This was open for the world to see, and international African observers. It was open in the world to see, open for the world to see. Sadly, the practice in so many parts of Africa and other parts of the world is to basically ring-fence the Election Commission. The Election Commission is basically co-opted as a state or a party political organ that says what it is told to say. And sensing defeat, we have seen that the practice in many other African and other countries around the world, faced with the election upset, what then happens is the internet is switched off, political party agents are beaten up, people are put on house arrest, armored personnel carriers are deployed around the Election Commission, and heavy intimidation then ensues. Now, the ANC, for all its faults and failings, which it has been humbled enough to admit, fortunately does not have those instincts that we see in many parts of the world. So in that context, I think South Africa becomes an exception rather than a norm. And I think that, again, will also strengthen the fundamentals of South African foreign policy, because I think there are lessons that other African countries, and indeed other countries in the world, including the advanced democracies, have to learn about from South Africa. So I think these are the three main opening remarks that I would put forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Nicely summarized. I like your reflections on what this election entails for the rest of Africa and the lessons that we can draw from it. South Africa's democracy may be fairly young, but it's definitely thriving and growing and doing much better than some of the old democracies. I'm going to invite Kofi next, and then afterwards we'll have Bob, and then we'll see if we can take questions. Please, colleagues, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. And also just a reminder, or just for information, we're recording this session, and it may be available later if anyone is interested.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start. Mine is basically, I hope I'm short, but I've got basically three prongs. The first one is to give you sort of a very summarized view of what I think the key pointers around the potential impact will look like in three elements. And then the second one is to deeper into the impact themselves. And then the third element will be share with you three scenarios, perhaps the best case scenario, I think, And then the worst case scenario, and perhaps also a sort of middle of the road type of scenarios, some kind of mixed scenarios. This is the kind of thing I do because I do a lot of scenario planning and foresight. So let me start with this one. I think this has been for me, as I've been watching this country for close to 30 years since I arrived here from Washington, D.C., from the World Bank, is that this has been really a huge political earthquake in the sense that it has this election and the outcomes have massive ramification for the political landscape in South Africa, not only for the African National Congress, for all of us who've been living here, but what it also tells me that South Africa is also what I call a crossroad nation. What do I mean by this? Is that all across those 30 years, there have been some kind of event that have put South Africa at the middle somewhere to choose a path, going somewhere, making decisions that have both risks, challenges, opportunities, dangers, and most important, potential hopes. So here are the three broad potential impact that I think what is now being seen as political coalitions in South Africa might yield. The first one, and I would join Paul in this, is the nature of the uncertainty of foreign policy. That is already clear. The second one is a shift in dominance of the African National Congress, which has been sort of the towering political party for the past 30 years, finding its strength and its power cut to size to 40%. I think that's a very important element of the impact. And then the third one is the sense that now there is this sort of element of coalition deal making. This is a very important point because it forces all the partners, all the political parties to either rethink their strategies, but at least compromise one or another about what they think they have to offer, not only to the political parties that they'll be working with, but to the South African nation by and large. And briefly, what it does is that those three elements of the potential impact alerts the decision makers, diplomats, foreign specialists, about the possible risks and opportunities, perhaps new ones. And I think I joined Paul there. It's a great opportunity to rethink, but every great opportunity, as the Chinese always say, come with a risk. It depends on how those political coalitions will look at them, see the interests, their own and those of the country, the citizens that they'll be serving. Now, in terms of strategic issues and the impact of these strategic issues, the foreign policy directions, there are a couple of things here. The one is the stability and consistency, which means a stable coalition government is likely to continue to help South Africa, having a strong sense of foreign policy strategy and maintain that active participation that it has in most of these international arena, including the BRICS or BRICS Plus initiatives with the European Union, with the United States and the West in general, of course, with Asia as well. The other one is the possible foreign policy shift. And this shift really could happen if the coalition involving the parties have different views and struggle to find an anchoring point where international relations, instead of becoming a powerful instrument of helping South Africa, it becomes a weaponizing instrument to first sort of undermine the internal national goals, and then later on present a fragmented view outside South Africa. The second big element beside foreign policy direction is economic policy, and then trade relations. This is a very important one. As much as we talk about political coalition, it is important to remember that economics is also a very, very important element. And if the economics, policies, and the trade relations are not stable, there will be an enormous amount of problems. And I think a shift, again, the status quo, which is not managed properly, will create quite a different or perhaps even very complicated impact, or at least managing goals for South Africa. And then I would say the third one, and then perhaps the last one coming after, is the diplomatic influence of South Africa. This is also important. Leadership and initiative here will be governed by two things: a strong coalition government to enhance South Africa's leadership across the board with the BRICS, with any other nation, or a coalition that's unstable will completely reduce South Africa's diplomatic clout and limiting its ability to influence all the foreign partners, including the BRICS, the United States, and so forth. And that also will force to have to review that internal focus on diplomatic influence. This is a very important place for diplomatic investment. If it's not well managed, there'll be problems. And the last one in the impact is another area that's, I think is important, is the strategic alliances and the partnerships across the board. That includes, of course, as I've already cited, the BRICS nations, the West in general, the Europeans, and then the Asians. This one must be done well. There are suspicions that if the coalitions are not stable, there will be some loss of strategic alliances, or South Africa will probably be seen as a suspicious partner, tending to play both ways. And this will have an impact on the long-term strategic alliances of South Africa going across the board. And it is also said that if the coalitions are stable, things might work out much better. The status quo might be strengthened. South Africa might be able to relate better with other countries as it's done already. And then, of course, I would now share the possible scenarios very quickly with you. There are three broad scenarios. The first one is scenario one, a stable South Africa. But the two driving forces that are really framing and shaping those scenarios are the post-coalition scenarios. They could be either stable or unstable. And then, of course, the other one is the role of South Africa outside in terms of foreign policy. What kind of foreign policy it will be? Is it fragmented, coherent, both at home and overseas? And these are the two driving forces that I see. So the first scenario, stable and cohesive coalition. The characteristics are very simple. The ruling coalitions will work well. The parties, these are assumptions, by the way, with strong leadership. And then the impact there in those scenarios are also clear. They'll have a very consistent foreign policy impact. South Africa might maintain active participation in most of these international institutions, including BRICS. Economic growth and stability will also help out if the coalitions are stable, because then they can focus on what really matters. And then the big one, leadership roles. South Africa will still have a leadership role, not just in South Africa itself, but also within the region and with the African region, and then, of course, beyond the African region. And that will probably enhance the influence of South Africa going forward. So this I will call the best case scenario, or the first preferred scenario. Scenario two, perhaps worst case scenario, fragmented and stable coalition. The characteristics are very clear. Parties are not working together. They don't want to talk together. They have different views, and divergent views will affect foreign policies dramatically, in addition to economic engagement internationally. And this frequent infighting will really lead to a deficit in leadership going in terms of policy directions. So the impact for this scenario two are very clear. Inconsistency in foreign policy, very deferring. People are not quite sure where South Africa stands. Are you with us or against us? And I think this can really have an impact on the reputation and image of South Africa in the short and long term, both in Africa and then also internationally. In Africa, there could be some problem with the United Nations Security Council, where Africa is now attempting to have a seat or two seats. South Africa could be viewed suspiciously. And the other impact is economic uncertainty. That is very, very important. If the political instability that takes place, it will have an impact on the politics is economics, economics is politics. The next one is the reduced diplomatic clout. This, South Africa must really pay attention to this, because it's very, very important, because it has impacts, of course, on economics, but also on the way South Africa is viewed and then either diminish its influence across the diplomatic spectrum. This is important. And then, of course, this, as I said, it's a worst case scenario. The last case scenario, I'll be quick, it's a coalition with divergent international alignments. The characteristics are quite interesting because they could create a balance between parties with a mix of pro-Western and pro sort of global South type of groups that makes everybody, quote unquote, happier. But this balance is very, very tricky. And because it's going to take some dexterity from South Africa to balance out the impact of its foreign policy, economic diversification, diplomatic flexibility, strategic ambiguity. This must be managed very, very properly, because if it's South Africa is too ambiguous, people will always continue having growing suspicions about it. This is what I call the middle of the road scenario, perhaps the second preferred one, which might probably take place as a realistic scenario. On that note, I want to say, to remind you again, in summary, the idea of a stable and cohesive coalition will be important. A fragmented and unstable coalition might emerge, which could be potentially true and realistic. But we're hoping that a preferred coalition with diverse international sort of balanced out will take place. This is my end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kofi. And thank you just for highlighting for us the importance of, stability, especially in this country, which, South Africa can also be said to be quite fragmented in many sectors. So it's very important that whatever coalition comes into place, stability is one thing that must be on the table. And thank you also for highlighting as well and painting the different scenarios for us, which scenario would mean. Much appreciated. I don't know if there are no questions at this point, so I'm going to move to Bob, and hopefully we'll have some questions afterwards. Bob, please, you can take.
Thank you very much, Kabaso, and thanks my colleagues who have preceded me. Paul, who is, as he mentioned in his own words, this is not my words, but his, that we've worked very closely, and beyond that, we are also friends. Kofi, a pleasure having you on board, and thanks for setting out the scenarios. My entry point is, of course, as my colleagues have pointed out, to look at what just happened in these elections. And of course, that we can all see in the news. We've been following that, but the key takeaway from that is that we've just had a very significant political development in South Africa, which has ramifications across the continent and in fact, potentially globally. This is basically the fact that the ANC went under 50% for the first time in 30 years. And that, of course, then sets the stage for very many, scenarios, as pointed out by Kofi to some extent, but also then implies that we are going to see quite some major changes in the country, but also globally. On the basis of that alone, in fact, let me just also point out very quickly, amongst other, major developments, is the fact that on the ANC party list, because, the South African, democracy is based on proportional representation. We are not going to see Naledi Pandor unless something changes, because she's not going to make it back to parliament, going by the proportional representation tenets. And you can go on and on, to discuss many other factors. But I think the framework that we can use to also, and in addition to what my colleagues have pointed out, is to look at inward and outward, levels of analysis. From an inward-looking perspective, and linking that into foreign policy, diplomacy, and international relations more broadly, it appears to me quite clear that South Africa's stature on the global stage is likely to be a little more muddled. It could even be reduced in terms of stature. And why do I say this? It is the very fact that when you are dealing with many problems internally, as they say, all politics is local. In fact, that's what these elections has shown us. If you are managing coalitions that are uncertain, if you are managing expectations of the populace that things might change for the better, if you are trying to reassure the public, and if you are actually trying to battle on many fronts at home, you have very little room to project outwardly. And particularly if the voices are discordant, if it's a Tower of Babel at home, then you are unlikely to, you can be one country with many voices, splitting yourself in many directions. So my first point of discussion here is, and I think colleagues have actually pointed out that whatever coalition the ANC goes into, whether it's the EFF or MK or IFP or a combination of all those, their foreign policy priorities, their foreign policy directions might differ quite a bit. And that's based on local scenarios as well, in the sense that a party such as the EFF, for example, is very keen to boost the Black citizen, the African citizenry, and that will have a play even in Parliament and in other forums internally. So that already demonstrates that the possibility of going out with one voice, as the ANC has done, will become very difficult. I think we've seen in the past couple of years, the ANC taking a decisive position. In fact, many have said the ANC has tended towards the global South. In fact, to the extent that, I mean, if you are tending towards the global South, it means you're turning your back towards the global North. Relations with the global North, particularly the US, have been, fractious. You can name any number of issues, including relations at the diplomatic level, where and of course we look at activities such as South Africa's naval or naval trainings or games with the Chinese and the Russians in the Indian Ocean. We look at South Africa's taking up the Palestine case, which was not quite welcome, at least in the beginning, from the West or the global North, if you wish, and all that. This is because the ANC was able to make a decisive decision based on the majority it had. That room now has gone away. Instead, it will have to negotiate with whichever partner it goes into in order to reach that point. And it is very uncertain that without a majority in Parliament, there will be one uncontested position. And therefore, all these factors demonstrate that the domestic scene is going to play a very important role in South Africa's outward looking possibilities. The energy to focus outside for an ANC that will be trying to make a comeback, for a DA, Democratic Alliance, that will be looking to whittle away the ANC support base, even as maybe it goes into the coalition, for an MK that will want to get outside of its KZN and Mpumalanga to some extent, locales. All those will suggest that the bigwigs of the parties, the leaders of these parties, will focus more locally and therefore not move out there to try to project, as Paul mentioned earlier, the outsized, almost punching above its weight kind of position for the ANC, and South Africa for that matter. This also suggests that South Africa's role as the leading voice for the African continent will be then whittled down. Again, just based on the fact that they will be tied down to local developments, to local strategizing, to domestic issues, so much so that speaking for the African continent, say in the UN, in the BRICS, and so forth, might not quite work as well. In fact, South Africa will be hosting the G20 summit next year. This will be one of the big tests, because if the G20 members, and of course, only recently, Africa was opted into the G20 as a member, through the AU. And that was one of the, in fact, what we learned from the developments leading to that is that this is the proposal that President Cyril Ramaphosa presented to President Joe Biden when he visited the country, I think in 2022, to try to repair damaged relations. So I think from the, inward looking out, unless we have, for example, the bureaucrats in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is called DIRCO here, Department of International Relations and Cooperation, holding forte, being given the leeway to undertake diplomatic work as the politicians fight it out there, both in at the national level, in Pretoria, and at the parliamentary level in Cape Town. Unless the bureaucrats are given the leeway, like the director generals and the people in the ministry more broadly, it will appear that South Africa will struggle to revert to the position where it was only a few weeks ago. So I think that's then, of course, again, in fact, even from the inward-looking perspective, another point one can make is the campaign was also based on the fact that African Black businesses were not benefiting as much as they used to before the Ramaphosa phase, whether right or wrong. That claim has been made. And so there will be a big fight for state resources, be it tenders, be it opportunities to do business with government, and related, industry matters, the coal industry, the mining industry, and so forth. That suggests that there will be some points of friction with international business in some form or shape. One has to remember that the Chinese have a very big stock of business, particularly in the natural resources sector, in the financial sector, and so forth. In the digital, technology sector as well, Huawei has a data center here and so forth. So there will be a point of friction with the local businesses who might have actually been involved in the campaigns with the understanding that they will have a bigger, play. Of course, the Americans have about 400 businesses here, under the American Chamber of Commerce. And that is also another, domestic kind of issue, which has links to the foreign policy play. But if you want to look at things then from the outside looking in, which is the other side, if you want to flip the coin, then you are looking at what are South Africa's current and future, current partners particularly, and those who might want to ramp up their relations with South Africa, given what just happened, will be looking to do. Of course, the big partner for South Africa under the ANC has been the BRICS. The BRICS, to some extent, has been, is almost synonymous, I must say, to China, because, China is almost the guarantor of the BRICS. It doesn't have the many challenges that South Africa itself has gone through, or India might go through, with Narendra facing an election shortly. Being a democracy, it's never assured, or that what we have seen in Brazil, where there can be a change of government based on electioneering. The BRICS has been on the ascent, has been on an upward trajectory based merely on the fact, at least from the continental perspective, that South Africa was doing its legwork for the BRICS on the continent. Now, with a coalition government of whatever form or shape, the BRICS will find it difficult to have, to ramp up relations, to even move on. In fact, it's actually President Cyril Ramaphosa who proposed the expansion of the BRICS at the summit here in Johannesburg last year, August last year. And which actually brought in then Ethiopia, Egypt from the continent, and a few other countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran. So I think the ascendancy of the BRICS in Africa particularly has been courtesy of the ANC. Now we do not have an ANC that can deal directly with Beijing on on good terms, on friendly terms. That becomes a challenge. So my looking into the crystal ball, this suggests that essentially the BRICS will have to go back to the drawing board, at least China in this particular case, to figure out what's likely to happen, whether it is going to be a coalition government or government of national unity. Of course, the Chinese, one must say, are always very pragmatic in the sense that they are malleable. They can change to fit situations. As we've seen in many situations, they can really be strategic and work with whatever partner comes on board. They have this policy of non-interference and sovereignty and so forth, so they might fit in. Now, I think the other perspective of outside looking in is the global north, and which often is synonymous to the United States of America. I think the United States of America relating with South Africa has been problematic, or has faced problems. Let me not say problematic, but has faced problems over the last couple of years, to the point where South Africa has been the subject of discussion and almost coming to legislation in Congress, kind of tending towards the US proposing sanctions or some form of punishment, quote unquote, for South Africa's relations with Russia, proximity to Beijing, as I mentioned earlier, South Africa's position on Palestine and taking Israel to the ICC, and so forth. The relations reached the lowest ebb over the last couple of months. And so in a situation such as this, I want to imagine American strategists and thinkers are not sitting on their laurels. They must be looking at what's happening now and seeing an opening. Because, when you have a situation of change, you look at what is possible here in terms of repairing relations or improving our position, because in fact, just recently, we've seen that, the US has kind of embraced the country called Kenya, which I must declare is my home country at this point in time. When it used to be South Africa, that was really considered the #1 partner of the US, although not stated in those, beauty contest terms. But, of course, South Africa is far larger in economy, has much, bigger impact than Kenya or any other, or most African countries for that matter. So I think in my reading of that development, in fact, was that South Africa was saying, let's go with Kenya, which is the economic powerhouse in East Africa, and see if we can make an entry to the continent through that route, since the South Africa route seems blocked. But now it seems to be opening. So what will be the opportunity here? One can actually start imagining that if the DA, for example, the Democratic Alliance, became the coalition partner or went into government of national unity with the ANC to form the new government, that gives a leeway, presents an opportunity for the US, but also European countries, the EU, UK, and so forth. But I think those will be my entry remarks. I think I will stayed my time. I'll stop there, and thanks, Kabaso. Right.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bob. You have put it very well. The summary on just how domestic issues have potential to affect what is happening on the outside. As we say, politics is about numbers. And so depending on how the collisions go, and based on what we have seen in this election, almost all the parties, I imagine, want to be, it's like going back to the drawing board. How can we do better? So it appears everyone will be seeking to increase their numbers. I'm going to pause here and see if we have one question actually in the chat, because after this, we're going to shift a little bit. The discussion will shift a little bit. So we have a question from, from Mandla Maduna. Mandla, maybe you can just unmute and ask the question. Is that okay? Do you mind? Or should I just read it? Okay, I'll go ahead and read the question. The question is addressed to Mr. Kofi. South Africa at the moment, we rejected ANC at the pause because ANC is now leaning towards private sector-led instead of sector-led development. How will the market respect the people's decision as we anticipate to take the left turn, but assuring policy certainty? We need to address the elephant in the room, white monopoly capital.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay, I'm not going to speak for the white monopoly capital, that's for sure. But it is really an issue that's been lingering. I mean, the thundering thumb on this election was to say, we are looking for a very different way of seeing how this country not only is run, but also implement some of its ideals and ideas. Now, for the past 30 years, we've seen, if I want to break those 30 years into two, we've seen 15 years without growth, economic growth. And there is no way anybody with any other ideology cannot take economics seriously. And of course, economics is where the white monopoly capital really reigns and has the power. Now, how do you make sure that white monopoly capital understand the plight of the majority of South Africans who are struggling to make the ends meet? So this is where the fight's going to take place. And that fight is that white monopoly capital need to understand that their monopoly in this country has been there for a long time. And we can see the result of it. It's not just blaming the African National Congress for having failed, because unemployment is one of the highest. Inequalities are growing. And then we received last month a very damning report, I think from the World Bank or the IMF, that South Africa is now the most unequal nation in the world, the top. So how is white monopoly capital really including this kind of data or this kind of situation in their way of operating in this country? They're going to have to yield some way. If not, something is going to break. And we know that. But I think a coalition that understand, even if it comes with the DA and the ANC, they're going to have to find a middle ground, as I said in one of the scenarios, a balanced ground where they have to address all the ills of the country. And these ills are the 3 or 4 big challenges, 3, unemployment, inequalities, and of course, poor economic, the list goes on and on. But the most important is that white monopoly capital cannot take the market as the only driver. The market is part of it, but the market must also serve people in South Africa. If that's not done, and this is where the Chinese have managed to do something that's a very powerful balance, which is not easy to accomplish. China may have a different context than South Africa, but these coalition or the coming coalition for the new government must learn from the mixed bag of being at the same time having a sense of market interests, market imperatives, as well as social imperative. Those must meet. If they don't meet, we have trouble in South Africa. If they do meet, we can see perhaps a great future in this country. I hope I've given a few insight that useful for this question.
Thank you very much, Kofi. Are there any other questions? You can just unmute and shoot if there's anyone who wants to ask. Otherwise, I have a question as well. I don't know who might address it, but probably anyone on the panel. I'm just thinking, the same collisions, to what extent would you say issues of foreign policy would determine which party the ANC enters a coalition with? Do you think that's even an issue, or for the most part, the ANC is looking at more domestic issues?
I think I can go first. Oh, Paul, you are ready. Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I mean, very briefly, I think it's not very easy right now to say with any degree of certainty what the calculations are within the ANC in terms of foreign policy, whether foreign policy issues will influence the kind of coalition partner they decide to go with. But in the process, I mean, the ANC and the EFF and others have said things in the press and have reacted to the election in different ways. And foreign policy issues have featured in those questions. So, for instance, Madame Lindiwe Sisulu the other day gave an extended interview on one of the channels, where she explained, she gave her view. It was her personal view, her perspective, but I guess it might reflect thinking in parts of the NEC, in the ANC, about why an alliance with the DA would not be preferable. And she spent quite a bit of time talking about what could happen to the ANC's foreign policy position. She talked about Palestine. She talked about BRICS. She talked about the African continent. She talked about partnerships with China, partnerships with Russia, and so on and so forth, right? Then if we look at the EFF talked about this as well. Julius Malema, when he was addressing the press shortly after the election results were announced, he talked about this as well. He talked about the EFF's positions on the situation in Palestine, and explained why the EFF would want to protect those equities in the upcoming coalition negotiations. And of course, he said that the EFF does not have a problem working with the ANC, but at the same time, he also said that the EFF is a relative. The EFF and the MK party are ideological relatives. And I guess he's right, because they don't differ much in terms of their fundamental policy platforms. But I would imagine that the ANC itself would want to protect some of those as much as possible, to protect its foreign policy equity when it enters into these negotiations. And it would not be a stretch to argue that that foreign policy is definitely going to be put on the table in terms of how much the ANC is willing to cede, and the red lines beyond which the ANC would not accept in terms of its foreign policy investments. So I think that's what I would say. It's definitely going to be at play. The question remains, what configuration of those equities will remain? And I think the answer to that depends on the type of coalition. If it is a stable coalition, then some of those equities can be defended and pursued, so that South Africa can speak with one voice. But if it's a chaotic transition, if it's a chaotic coalition, like my brother Kofi was pointing out, then all bets are off the table. Different voices speaking different things. That will not be helpful, and it will diminish and undermine South Africa's influence globally.
Thank you, Paul. Bob, do you want to come in?
Sure, very briefly, I think I'll still go to your question. I'll still go with the idea that the common adage is that all politics is local, as in all politics. It starts at home, and in fact, where we are at now, before it becomes international or global, particularly if you look at where we are now, I know that all the negotiating parties from all these parties will be at the back of the mind having foreign policy, international relations, and diplomacy in their thinking. But as of now, they are looking at who is going to blink first because of the issue of numbers. Who gets what, where, what does this mean for us going forward? And of course, we are in a very big ideological battle contest rather. And so I think domestic imperatives are quite paramount here, and the foreign policy play will follow. I think those were my observations. Thank you.
This is Kofi. I would agree with Bob, but time is important. At first, they will realize that local is important, but when they get their act together, they'll realize that there's a much bigger world out there that, in fact, control local politics, and we will see that very, very soon. And at the heart of this conversation will be people will find out very quickly the strength of the DA, the Democratic Alliance, because of the relationships it's built outside the country. And that's going to come to play very, very quickly. And even with the 21%, people are looking at the DA not just as a local power, but a local power with tentacles all around the world, with powerful supporting elements. Remember that the DA had already sent, before the elections, the DA had sent a couple of letters to the United States to support South Africa's election process by increasing the number of observers, because they were not quite sure about how the process was going to end. They also sent a letter to the European Union asking for support, and they have the support in these places. And this is where other political parties in the coalition is going to have to realize that local is not enough, but also keeping an eye on what's happening outside will be very, very important to be able to survive. South Africa doesn't live in a sort of oasis. In fact, what made South Africa historically is the interest that really came from outside to build and make what South Africa is as a country. The wealth of South Africa built the rest of the world, England, Europe, and all other places. If you talk about some of the early billionaires, the mining magnates like, Barney Barnato, but even the famous Cape to Cairo person, I don't want to say his name here, but Rhodes, to say it. All of this still has an impact on the country. By and large, and this is the hardest part to really deal with, while the local element is important, we're now finding that economically, South Africa doesn't have a system, an economic system that really deals with the local interests or helping the local economy grow better to benefit everybody else. So I would say, I know it's a bit controversial, that every time I hear that South Africa is the first producer of platinum, first producer of iridium, and with all those rare metals, but the revenues don't really come in and build a country. So it's less local than we think it is. But I like, Bob, what you said. It's a local issue, but very quickly, to summarize, South Africa is going to have to pay attention to what's outside it.
Thank you so much, Kofi. I'm now going to invite Valerie. Valerie is going to be speaking to the youth vote. As crucial as this election was, we have heard that only about 2% of the youth turned up to vote. So Valerie will speak to us about the youth vote. Valerie?
Hi, can you hear me? The first thing that I wanted to say is that one thing that we have to remember about South Africa, just like most other African countries, is that we are a very young country. According to the latest statistics, the average age is only 27 and a half. But if you look at the political candidates or the presidential candidates for the three leading parties, the DA's party leader is the youngest at 48, whilst ANC's candidate Ramaphosa is 71. Jacob Zuma is 82 years old. Those people do not necessarily speak to and address or represent people who are young people in this country. And oftentimes it seems as though the voice and position and opinion of the majority of the group is not often represented in the political dispensations that we've had previously. So going based off of this, in my preparations for this, I took a little look into the province of Gauteng, which is the economic hub of the country, and looked at places that are majority youth population. So where it's people who are student places near universities. And if you look at the IEC's polls or position of who got the most votes, the parties that lead in those places, such as Braamfontein in Johannesburg and Auckland Park, where there's University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, as well as Hatfield in Pretoria, where the University of Pretoria is located. The leading party for those regions for the national, provincial, and regional election was the EFF. While this is different from what the rest of the country voted for, because the leading three parties is ANC, DA, and MK. So this tells us that there's a certain level of disconnect between what young people are feeling and thinking and what the rest of the country is thinking, or the rest of the majority of people are actually coming and saying. So based off of that, in the previous elections that just passed now, only 4.4 million young people, so between the age of 20 to 29, there were 11 million people who were eligible to vote. But of those people, only 4.4 million actually registered to vote. So it's an issue that has been ongoing of how do we get young people to participate or even have a show and demonstrate their opinion about where do they envision not only their local and regional places, but also the government's foreign policy. Where do they wish to deposit their interest and support? So if we look at what has just happened, it seems as though young people, the parties and the people that they voted for, which is after the ANC or the EFF in those student regions of Gauteng, the next most parties was EFF, or was MK and ANC. So this tells us that young people, by and large, support the current status quo of our foreign policy. They support the idea of South Africa being a partner and a player in BRICS. They support the idea of South Africa taking a leading position in the ICJ court case against Palestine. They support South Africa's neutrality, if we can call it that, towards Russia. Young people in South Africa don't necessarily have an opinion about foreign policy that differs from what is the current status quo. So it seems as though when we are going off of what Bob just said about the looking outwards, young people have the position that where South Africa is located at now, its policy, its position, and its stance towards the international power players, they agree with what has been done and what we are currently doing. The issue, however, is the looking inwards. So when we look inwards, it seems as though, based off of the vote that we just had, young people are not satisfied with the current status quo of the economics, how we are representation in the economic space, in the political space, in different spheres of the society that we live in, because currently youth unemployment is still a huge issue, where also based on the latest studies, only 4 out of 10 young people have a job. Those are people who are, and that's not including people who are studying or people who have actually given up. And if we consider how many people those might actually be, we actually have a picture where the majority of the country is dissatisfied with the current direction, and the idea of voting out people who have made the society the way that it is currently shows that there is a desire within young people to see a change in the current structure of job opportunities, of economic policy. But if you also look and consider that as well, that tells us there is actually a desire for change in foreign policy, changes in how we look at how foreign companies invest, multinational corporations. Young people wish to see a place where they have opportunities to be entrepreneurs and be supported by the government, and not only have a position where they have to wait continuously and consistently to have change happening. Because if we look at that group of people, the 20 to 29-year-olds, those are what we have termed the born frees. Those are all people born after the year 1994. So these are people who have not experienced apartheid. They have no idea and concept of what actually happened then, but they have lived continuously in a society that is transitioning. And they are in a position where they say, we have seen the transition, we've seen things changing, but when are we actually going to benefit from it? When are we going to have a country that prioritizes the people that make up the majority? And that is not just about in terms of race, but also in terms of demographics, because it seems as though there are developments in the country, but they're not benefiting the majority of the group of people that exist and will be there in the future. So I think not just in places like South Africa, but even, for example, in the latest elections in India, which have just concluded, we see that there is a lack and apathy in the youth voter turnout, because there seems to be the concept and idea that even if I do vote, even if I do have a position about I want to see my country looking like this or like that, there's no actual way to effect change. So whilst there is the option to go and make a vote and select for a party or whatever, at the end of the day, when you see that the party you have selected, say, for example, in the context of Bloemfontein, where Wits is located, the people have all come out and said at about 38% of the vote from here in Bloemfontein, they all supported the EFF. But the EFF has actually lost votes nationally. Where does that put the youth vote? Where does that put the significance of my opinion when in the country I have this idea of what I want to see happening? But the reality is seemingly no one else has that same position and idea. So there's a certain disenfranchisement of where the youth lies in terms of policy. And I believe that we need to actually find a way to reconcile what the young people are saying and what the rest of the country is saying, because it seems as though, will this end up being a radical shift in policy and positioning in the future when those young people become the leaders of the country? Does this mean that the South Africa we are building currently will not be the South Africa that exists in 30 years? So I believe there needs to be some kind of negotiation and consideration of young people and their positions, because it's not enough to have youth leagues and student commands and different bodies and entities that speak for the youth in your party, but not actually having them represented and participating in the overall decision-making and policy, because that alienates the people who are going to be dominating in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Thank you for giving us that perspective on what the youth in South Africa are looking for, generally speaking, and also just highlighting for us how the youth around Gauteng, particularly Bram, voted. Prof. Munyai, good afternoon and welcome. I see your hand is up. Please, you may speak.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I hope you can hear me. Thank you. Greetings and my apologies. I joined late due to a number of reasons. But I'm happy that you covered ground. But just to pick up on the last speaker, there's an elephant in the room. I think we've spoken a great deal about numerous elections taking place all over the world. And there are a lot of similarities. As I speak, I'm in St. Petersburg in Russia. Speaking to colleagues from India who just came from elections as we did, speaking to friends in Mexico. This elephant in the room, it's about the liberal democracy itself. I think we need to go just beyond the mechanical, looking at the cues and boxes that are ticked, and really start asking the real bigger question that even our colleagues in the US are also confronted. How does democracy itself satisfying the people? It's well and good to really attack all sorts of people and forces that these are anti-democratic and the like. But it appears that there are somehow creeping in inherent inadequacies of liberal democracy at this moment, juncture in the world politics. I think that question needs to be confronted head on and say these unhappiness with the system, regardless of ANC, whether corrupt or not corrupt, the constitution and all these stories and colors that we paint, ask about the system itself. I mean, looking at the US, the storming of the Capitol Hill on the 6th of January, and all sorts of these unhappiness that we're seeing, we need to interrogate beyond just following each and every elections and have meetings of this nature. So I think my real concern is that we really need to get to the bottom of the issue and start addressing them without really casting any doubt on the system that I fully support and live with. So what exactly are those issues? What is it in the system? Its inability to deliver. For 30 years, people queue 5 years after 5 years. And there has been that hope and enthusiasm. My very first vote was 1994, young in my early 20s, excited. And I do not think this year when I queued in the vote, I'm not among those who abstained. My kids did, but I didn't have that oomph. I just queued as a routine. All the excitement of the yesteryears are dying, and I'm not sure if I'm going to vote in the next election. I don't know, and it's free speaking. I thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Valerie, do you have any reactions to that?
So my one thing is I do actually want to say I do share that sentiment because there is no excitement. The idea of we are simply voting for the same people to do the same things and not actually change the system or change anything about how we are actually living our everyday lives. And most people actually would tell you that it's not, they don't see the purpose in engaging in elections, especially young people, because there is a desire to vote. Because I'll even say when I voted, I stood in the line for almost 5.5 hours. I was determined to stay there. And most of the people there were actually quite young because we voted at a university campus. And they were also willing to say, I'm going to stay for almost 6 hours to vote. But at the same time, it was like, why? Why do we even, I'm just doing it because now it's the sunken cost fallacy. I invested time to come here. That's the only reason I'm not leaving. But I'm not actually voting because I believe that there will be actual change enacted in society. And I believe that many times politics and politicians tend to exist in their own sphere where they don't realize that oftentimes the way that they engage in campaigning, the way that they engage in making and releasing their manifestos, they don't do so in a way that actually makes people want to go out and support them, because oftentimes it's a regurgitation of your last manifesto. And if you look, there's very few changes in policy, there's very few changes in how we're going to see. And that's why you even see parties like MK, new people who are just, they haven't even been around for a year. Who knows what their actual outcome will be? but people are willing to say, let's do something different, anything different, because currently the options that exist are not satisfactory, and many people won't be happy with the system as it is.
Thank you, Valerie. Professor Kajagala.
Thank you again. I think I just wanted to raise a few. This was a very fascinating discussion. I think in this early phase of South Africa's election, it's important to have these discussions. So thank you again for hosting the event. Paul, on your discussion with the point about foreign policy is important here, but I think you made a point that I want to disagree with, which is that foreign policy is very strong or has been strong. And my point arises from what Bob was talking about in terms of the future of a foreign policy that is going to be diminished, which I think I agree more with than your very optimistic reading. And these are my points. One is that foreign policy since '94 has actually been largely an ANC policy. And I think we have to put it very clearly that there has not been a South African policy, foreign policy, if you could put it that way. That means there has not been an opportunity to develop national interest-centered policies because of the very dominance of the one party in the foreign policy domain, but also in the domestic domain. So what we are now going to find, I think, my reading is that if you have any form of coalition government, it is actually going to create the conditions where now bureaucrats have more room in foreign policy. Rather, you have the opportunity for the creation of a more broad-based foreign policy in South Africa, rather than a foreign policy where probably DIRCO comes up with some policy, the minister says something, and then she's overruled by the party. And this is kind of not the way to develop what I'm calling a national interest-based foreign policy. So that was just my reaction, because I think I like Bob's analysis of it, that it may diminish because there are more parties coalescing around foreign policy, but more parties also coming up with different perspectives on what South Africa's position in the world should be. So that's just my quick point. But on Valerie, I think it's a very excellent analysis of the problem of youth. And I look at it actually seriously as a question of, as you are saying, there is confusion among the youth about what they want. There is a dalliance with EFF. And that is, I don't think, for instance, if the EFF was elected theoretically here, I don't know whether the EFF addresses the economic issues that the youth actually want, because you are talking about youth really interested in economic in economic enhancement and all these opportunities that have not been opened up for them. So they are voting for a party that potentially may not even actually bring the results that a lot of them want. But I also like the point that you're making is that the issue of apathy still remains very dominant among the youth. So we have a very limited population of young people, even within the 18 to 35 voting actually. So we need to come up with a place where youth can really vote and make a difference. And I don't know how that, whether that is the role of the EIEC, because I remember that, as you are saying, places like Wits, people on the lines for 7 hours. I mean, it's a very simple problem that you just increase the number of voting stations. And therefore, it was terrible for youth not to vote, even that, in fact, they haven't been voting as much as they should. So I just want to say that I really enjoyed that discussion. But I agree with most of what people are saying. Thank you again, Kabaso.
Thank you, Prof. Paul, do you have any reactions before I come to Mandla?
Yes, well, first of all, it's nice to have Prof on the panel again. I've been on panels with him previously, and I think I'll be on a panel with him in the coming weeks or so. But yes, yes, definitely the ANC for sure has been extremely dominant, and even in its party literature, when it was in the underground, the ANC was doing some very serious foreign policy. Albert Lutuli was a Nobel laureate. The ANC sent delegations. It had diplomatic status in quite a number of African countries and countries around the world. There was the anti-apartheid movements in the US, in the UK, and so on. The ANC had, as a party, as an underground party, it had significant international clout. I mean, it signed the Geneva, the law of armed conflict. I think it was the first liberation movement in history to do that, and so on. It had support in the UN and so on. So I think that they developed a certain finesse around foreign engagement. This sort of internationalist stances of the ANC, which afforded them sanctuary in many countries, and the ANC is not the only liberation movement that has done that. The liberation movements tend to be good at that. So yes, definitely there's been dominance, but I still think that there are elements of South African foreign policy since 1994 that have not necessarily been ANC positions. So, for instance, when you look at South Africa's engagement in multilateral institutions, when you look at the fact that some of those positions have been very centrist. South Africa has taken very centrist positions on a number of international questions. Secondly, South Africa has deployed non-ANC diplomats. As we speak, I think Martinus van Schalkwyk is the ambassador to Australia. I think he's a Freedom Front Plus or so at one point in time. Tony Leon, who is on the DA negotiating team, was actually Jacob Zuma's ambassador to a number of Latin American countries, I think Uruguay, Paraguay, and I think Argentina. And these are not the only ones. So I think there's also been, yes, it's, the ANC has been dominant. I agree with Prof. But I also think that there are elements of the foreign policy that have not necessarily been party-centric in that particular sense. And then in addition to that, there have been other influences on South African foreign policy, such as, at one point at least, I don't know what the situation is today, but at one point think tanks were making quite a contribution. I remember during the when the Department of Foreign Affairs, as it was called then, was coming up with South African policy on participation in international peace missions. That was a very, very broad-based, the organization I was working for at the time is one of the organizations that participated in that process. So there was a sense that the Department of Foreign Affairs wanted to get public inputs, and those inputs were not always given by organizations that were sympathetic to the ANC. So I also just want to highlight that perhaps I should have clarified it in my earlier comments, that there have been elements, there have been strands of South African foreign policy. I almost said ANC foreign policy. There have been strands of South African foreign policy that have not necessarily been ANC. Having said that, I very much agree with, I think it was Prof who talked about the importance of the opportunity that there will be now for the DGs and others, civil servants within the civil service apparatus and machinery, that will now have an opportunity to exert more influence because they manage foreign policy. They don't necessarily make it, but they manage it. I think there'll be opportunities for that. And if one looks at the nature of the civil service during those early years of foreign policy, I mean, it was quite, there were people from the liberation movements, there were people from the former government, there were professionals and so on. So I think there'll be an opportunity for that. And really, foreign policy at the end of the day has got to rest on very strong foundations within an independent and impartial civil service. So I think that could be an opportunity also.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. We have 2 questions in the chat. Mandla, if you don't mind, I can go ahead and ask a question. I can read it out, or do you want to just ask the panelists yourself? Okay. So Mandla's question, I want to ask from anyone on the panel, are we as Africans aware of the business, especially largely white, that funds Black political parties? It seems this is a strategy of fragmenting the Black votes, which we end up speaking in different voices. Just my observation. And then I'll read the next one so that the speakers can address both of them at the same time. This is from Moshe. All liberation movement in Africa is losing support because of failure to deliver in terms of domestic policy outputs. China Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative proving to be successful. Is it not high time Africa boosts the AfTA, which is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and perhaps open the discussion of global Africa trade to achieve sustainable development? I'll ask, maybe Kofi can start, and then we can go around the table.
Yeah, I think on the political, I'll try to see if I can summarize for both questions. On the funding to political parties, being white or not, money talks, and we've seen more and more that if Africans cannot really organize themselves economically, financially, and be able to support themselves, they will not succeed. Somebody else will play the game for them, or they'll divide them. This has been going on for many, many years now. So, in fact, we can't blame the capitalists for funding, multiple parties at the same time. This is a gamble. They fund both sides or many sides with the hope that they reduce their own risk to be able to influence the process of really having return on their investment. They are making investment, and until Africans who have money understand that, they should also play that game. It's a tough game out there, and if we don't do that, we're going to be losing out, and we can already see the results. Many of the billionaires, African billionaires or millionaires, I'm afraid to say, where do they spend their money? You probably see where it is. It's really something that they need to look into. They don't really take seriously the investment in the media, for example, be able to have a narrative, be able to have a base, or investing in building universities. I've said that many times. I've been around South Africa for almost 30 years. I was just looking forward to see if there was going to be an African university or university directly funded by the billionaires who are here. Not much. You look also, I'm stretching a bit out to outside South Africa. I know it's a bit uncomfortable to say this about Mo Ibrahim. Mo Ibrahim is spending a huge amount of money to give money to the retired, I wouldn't say dictator, but African leaders who don't need that money. The young people need that money. He should be putting that money not to retired African leaders, but to people who need to make, a case for young people. Young people are completely confused largely, and I think Bobo will make that case in South Africa. They can't figure out where to go find the advice to be able to change their lives. Many of us, when we were young, as much as we struggled a bit, but I think we didn't feel so depressed as what we're seeing now, largely. My case may be a bit different, but the youth are really in big trouble. Now, when it comes to China, there's also a lot to learn from China. I keep all the time, Professor David Moynihan and I are there's not one day when we don't talk about this sort of missing leadership and listening to cases that could help Africa. What is it that South Africa is struggling with to learn from China? As much as we've talked about the fact that South Africa is the biggest economy on the continent, but it doesn't trickle into the realities of the country. So for me, South Africa is not really the biggest one, because if its impact, its effects, and the ability to transform its own context and environment is not taking place, I don't consider that really a powerful country. And this is something really to think about, which comes down to the democratic element. You know, how democratic is what we're looking at today, not just in terms of voting, but in terms of impact on the lives of people. And so I'm not saying China is going to bring that out, but at least China has democratized capitalism, not just in China, but in the world. And there are huge lessons there to learn. We hear a lot of issues about, autocratic government, dictatorship, and so forth. But they've changed the lives of 1 billion people. It's never almost seen since, modern time. What can South Africa learn from this? How fast could South Africa move to find coalitions? I'm not saying South Africa should suppress other political parties, but find a way so that this democratic capitalism really reach its stores. And I think there's a lot to learn there from China. To me, South Africa is not moving fast enough. Perhaps some of you are seeing this, but the evidence is screaming out loud. The increased poverty, unemployment that goes off, inequalities. These are very simple things. Corruptions. So as much as we like South Africa, there's a lot to be done. And hopefully the coalition that's coming in will be able to do something. But I doubt they'll be able to do it quick enough. But they have the next 5 years to do something. If they don't, I'm afraid South Africa is probably going to have to live the fate of many African countries.
Thank you, Kofi. Very quickly, Bob, and then Paul, just your quick comments to the comments in the chat, as we are running behind time, and also your concluding remarks. Thank you.
Right. I think I'll be a quick first point on the issue of the corporate South Africa, which is largely white, funding African political parties. I've actually heard that this lots of stuff is circulating via social media, and I saw a clip that many of you might have seen, alleging as much. In fact, in a press conference, is it a press conference or a radio interview with the EFF leader, claiming as much. And it might be true or not true, because it is in the speculative space. But what is clear is that the fragmentation is actually quite evident. The suggestion from some quarters has been that these very many parties, we had, I think, upwards of close to 70 parties contesting the elections. If you look at any graph, you'll see ANC, DA, MK, EFF, and then you go down the line. So it's quite many parties. But I think the more important point one can actually make here, at least from my perspective, is that corporate South Africa and the populace, and actually also to Kofi's point, I think there is an unfinished business coming out of appetite. And as we heard from Valerie, I think the metrics are such, I think Kofi and Valerie in some respects, the metrics are such that South Africa now is one of the most unequal country in the world. I think corporate South Africa will do well to not, even if they're involved in the political world and so forth, to actually keep an eye on the fact that inequality is equals to instability. Because the message that has come largely from the DA is that they want stability so that business can continue thriving, and that parties such as MK and EFF are equals to the so-called the red thing, economic transformation, radical economic transformation, which equals to instability. And so I think the key point will be that the resolving of the unfinished business of how formerly disadvantaged people can also benefit from the economy will be important. I think to the issue of the liberation movements, Paul touched on that, but I'll add a point to say what we've heard loud and clear from these elections is that there's an element of inward looking. Particularly, I'll point out one particular party is called the PA, whose leader has come out very clearly to say he will kick out Africans from other countries. Of course, he got about 2% or so. He will kick out other Africans from other countries and so forth. And then on the other hand, we have the EFF and MK that are saying that are actually kind of taking, let me put it as an anti-West stance, for lack of a better way. I think it can be put in a more sophisticated way, but that's the best I can do for now, for lack of better words. So now you have a situation where it is turning against foreign interests and so forth. What then happens is you have a situation that could go the way of, and I'm not scaremongering here, of countries such as, say Zimbabwe, say Venezuela, countries that faced off with the populations from other countries and decided to, be inward looking and so forth. I'll stop there. Back to you, Kabaso.
Thank you so much, Bob. Paul, just very briefly as well, and your concluding remarks.
Okay, I think I'll just say one thing. South Africa, of course, is, as we all know, is a very complicated country. It's a country of contrast. I think big capital in South Africa and internationally has got to understand one thing, that the best way to avoid or to mitigate, for instance, the kind of riots that we saw in July 2021 in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, okay, to avoid that kind of instability, to avoid the deep alienation, the income inequalities that produce violence, to avoid this apathy in the political process, it is important to address core issues. And those core issues cannot just be addressed by demanding or insisting that there must be, market or stability to serve markets. I think South Africa's, because South Africa has one of the highest rates of labor unrest, service delivery protests that we see every year, there's absolutely no way, at least in my view, that these issues that we're talking about can be addressed without addressing, for instance, the issue of land, without addressing the inequality. The youth unemployment is so high. It doesn't matter how well the country does in terms of economic fundamentals. I mean, the economy was growing by 5-6% under Thabo Mbeki, but still, the income inequalities in South Africa are really unimaginably very, very high. So I think there needs to be, in terms of self-reckoning, I think, yes, for sure, the ANC and all the other parties need a sense of self-reckoning. Even the DA, which has been literally hovering at 20, 21, 23% and has not, that's basically their ceiling. And everybody else, I mean, none of them was able to get that majority. So I think, there's that sense that the ANC is not the only one that needs to be humble moving forward. But at the same time, I think big business business monopolies and so on, as they're called in South Africa, also need to engage in a process of self-reckoning, because the anger and the dispossession that we have seen in South Africa, and some of it has also been expressed in the run-up to this election, if it is not addressed and addressed urgently, I think what this vote, one of the things this vote has said, is that the country could be at a tipping point. And I think the captains of industry and big business in South Africa also need to engage in a very, very serious process of self-reflection, because there's no way, stability can be enhanced, with those deep inequalities. I think that's what I would say to that question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all our speakers. We've gone a little beyond the allocated time, but it was necessary. I want to take this opportunity.
Very quickly, can I say one line?
Sure, sorry.
Yeah, so my parting line is the nature, the strength, the health of South African foreign policy is deeply dependent on the quality of the local and national well-being of its people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kofi, and apologies for that. We have another webinar coming up on the 25th of June. Hopefully then we'll have had the government in place. So it would be nice to see all of you join us again to continue this discussion. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we hope that the next time we meet, this new government will be one, that balances between the people's aspirations and promotes growth and stability for the country. Thank you so much, and see you next time.